Okay, this is the third video for the second week of economics, and we're actually going to be considering the supply curve. We looked on the last video at the demand curve, now we're looking at the supply curve. So, let's say you grow tomatoes. Now your tomatoes sell for £100 a tonne. The price goes up to £150 a tonne. So if I was to ask you, how would you respond to that as a question? I suspect it's quite likely you may actually say, well, you're likely to grow more tomatoes. You may actually need to employ more staff to help you. You may need to buy more fertiliser. But I think you're likely to say, actually, we're going to grow more tomatoes. If I ask a second question and say, well, how would you respond if you grow lettuce instead and there's no change in the price of lettuce? Well, in this instance, if you grow tomatoes and lettuce and tomatoes increase, you may actually want to grow more tomatoes and less lettuce. So I think it's fair to say that if nothing else changes, then we can expect supply to increase when the price increases. I think there's going to be higher levels of output required for the higher costs, because there might be more cost on wages, there might be more cost on materials, but higher prices do of course lead to higher profits. And there could be higher prices may actually encourage new entrants to the market. Because the price is expensive, there's more profit, more people actually may be inclined to give it a go. So the impact of price is really important in supply decisions. If we were to plot this on our graph again, now as you can see with the demand curve, we could actually draw a very similar supply curve. And I think you actually look at this thinking, well, actually this is quite similar to the demand curve, but the slope of the curve actually goes the opposite way. As the price increases, so the curve goes up. The quantity of supplies, or the amount of the product supplies, are actually willing to do at that price. And I think if you look at this carefully, you can see that at £5 there's 100 units sold, and at £25 there's 700 units sold. It becomes more profitable, and as it becomes more profitable, more people actually enter the market. So if we think about the determinants of supply, and as with demand, supply can be affected by factors other than price. It could be affected by the cost of production. If it goes down, then it's more profitable to make more. So if we were to use, for example, a TV as an example, if a TV can be sold at £300 and the cost of production is £200, it's profitable. If the production costs fall, it's equivalent of the price increasing to the supplier. And actually you may want to sell more than previously, and you may choose to increase your supply. But if you turn it round and the costs go up, then actually it's quite likely that you'll see a reduction in your supply. If we think about the profitability of alternatives, we think about substitutes in supply. If there's less substitutes available, it's likely that more of the product will be supplied. But if it's more profitable to supply, say, peppers, you might start growing these instead of something else. You need to think about the profitability of goods in joint supply. For example, being a waste product. If you make flat pack furniture, then the offcuts may be chipped and may be used to sell animal bedding. Good example here of actually, of a good in joint supply. So if you supply more furniture, you may have more chippings available. With supply as well, need to be aware of things like nature and random shocks, perhaps bad weather, poor harvests, and then the expectations of future price changes, perhaps in the item itself, the finished product, or it could be the cost of materials. So if fertiliser goes up, the chances are so will the effect of the price of tomatoes. So continuing on these determinants of supply, the supply curve can show us what happens to supply when the price changes, all things being equal, as discussed earlier. What it doesn't show is what happens when other determinants change. So when this change occurs, the supply curve will move accordingly. So it would actually show us the impact of these changes. So for example, here we are. We have an increase in supply. An increase, if you remember, moves to the right, as with the demand curve. The shift is rightwards, and you can see from the blue curve, the original, and we have the red curve afterwards. Likewise, if there's a decrease in supply, it's a leftward shift. Thinking back about how we could label things up, this chart looks at the impact of a decrease in supply. So if you look at when the price is £15, if we look at Q0, that's the original quantity, it shows the quantity supplied is 350 units. The supply now decreases, and Q1 represents the quantity supplied on the new supply curve, S1. And you can see the leftwards decrease to around 175 units. So the demand decreases if the supply is at the same price. So the suppliers are prepared to sell less of that product because they're making less money on it. With a decrease in supply, again we can see the decrease in the supply is from S for supply 0 to S1, the first change, for the same price, which is P, and the quantity produced falls from Q0 to Q1, and the change in this quantity is actually referred to as delta Q.